You wake to the sound of steel being drawn across stone, a whisper of metal in the damp gray of dawn, deliberate and unhurried. The air tastes of rain and rust, and somewhere beyond the walls, a bird sings once before falling silent. You are not afraid, not yet, but even your heartbeat feels counted, measured, as though time itself is being sharpened for the moment it will finally strike. Before we step into this haunting morning together, take a moment to join our growing circle of history lovers. Like this video if the past still finds ways to move you, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, whether from London, Lisbon, or Lagos. It's astonishing that across oceans and centuries we gather to remember a single morning in 1536, when silence itself seemed to bow before a king's command. The Tower of London had not slept that night. In the small hours of May 19th, torches hissed in the damp air, throwing restless shadows against the stone. The Queen's household, those few ladies who had remained faithful, moved like mourners before the funeral. Some wept softly, others worked in near silence, folding veils and arranging linen with trembling hands. At the center of this solemn motion sat Anne Boleyn. She had been awake since before the bell of St. Peter ad Vincula struck 4. Chroniclers would later write that she seemed calm, even serene. "I have done no justice to deserve death," she told her chaplain, "but I submit me to the will of God." Her voice, they said, did not waver. It was not the voice of a queen undone, but of a woman already past fear. Outside her chamber, the world was preparing for spectacle. A scaffold had been built on Tower Green rather than on Tower Hill, a mark of the strange reverence still accorded her. The carpenter's hammers which had echoed through the night had fallen silent at dawn. The boards gleamed pale beneath the mist, the straw newly laid to absorb what would come. The French executioner, brought secretly from Calais, tested the balance of his sword, an elegant two-handed blade said to make the death mercifully swift. But mercy in Tudor England was never without performance. Every step of Anne's final morning had been choreographed for effect. The color of her gown, the choice of witnesses, the measured distance from chapel to scaffold. This was no simple execution. It was the staging of obedience. Henry VIII would not merely destroy his queen, he would cleanse his kingship of doubt. Inside the tower, Anne knelt in prayer. She wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur, a crimson petticoat beneath, and a small coif upon her dark hair. The ladies helped her pin a small cross at her breast. The smell of beeswax and incense lingered from the chapel, mixing with the cold scent of the river. One lady later recalled that Anne smiled as she prayed. Another swore she whispered, "Jesu, receive my soul." By 8 o'clock, Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, entered her chamber. "Madam," he said softly, "the hour is come." She nodded once. As she rose, one of her ladies faltered, unable to hold back a sob. Anne touched her cheek lightly. "Peace, sweetheart," she said. "Do not weep, for I have long prepared for this death." When she stepped out into the courtyard, a faint breeze lifted the edge of her veil. The tower seemed almost to hold its breath. From the chapel to the scaffold was only a short walk, but it felt eternal. Along the route, guards stood at intervals, their armor catching the first light of day. Courtiers gathered at a distance, their faces unreadable. Some came out of duty, others out of curiosity, but a few, perhaps, out of pity. Anne mounted the steps without hesitation. She looked over the crowd, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice clear enough to reach the outer gate, she spoke. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, and by the law I am judged to die. I do not say that I have been justly condemned, but I forgive all men willingly." There was a stillness after her words, the kind of silence that feels alive. Even the executioner bowed before her. "Madam," he said with a French accent, "your grace need fear nothing. I strike true." She smiled faintly, perhaps at the irony that her deliverance would come not from England but from France, As she knelt upon the straw, she repeated her final prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my spirit. Her ladies stepped forward, removing her coif and binding her eyes with a white cloth. One of them began to sob uncontrollably. Anne's lips curved upward one last time. A small, steady smile, defiant against the machinery of her undoing. The sword flashed once. No drum, no cry, only a swift whistle of air and the soft thud of inevitability. The body trembled, then was still. Kingston turned away. A boy who had been holding the Queen's cloak fainted. A hush fell over the tower so deep that even the river seemed to pause its current. But the execution was not an ending. It was a beginning, a ritual cleansing meant to restore the illusion of divine right. Yet in that quiet moment after the fall of the blade, something shifted. The crowd did not cheer. The courtiers did not speak. For the first time, Henry's power felt fragile, as though the very air had been cut by the same sword that silenced his queen. The Frenchman wiped his blade clean. The witnesses dispersed. And far below, in the cold stones of the tower, a new legend began to stir, the story of a woman who refused to die quietly and whose ghost would forever remind England that even crowns can tremble. The blade was sharp, the ritual perfect. But history remembers the silence that followed. The fall of Anne Boleyn did not begin with shouting in the streets or daggers drawn in shadowed corridors. It began with silence, the kind that lives between glances, behind polite laughter, and in the hollow pauses of a king's waning affection. In that stillness, Thomas Cromwell began to weave. By the spring of 1536, the English court glittered on the surface but was rotten underneath. Henry VIII, now in his mid-40s, carried both a limp from his jousting accident and a festering frustration that no son had yet secured his dynasty. Anne, once his obsession, had become the embodiment of his failure. The miscarried child of January, rumored to have been male, had broken something irretrievable between them. Into this breach stepped Jane Seymour, pale, compliant, and perfectly unthreatening. The king's gaze turned elsewhere, and with it, the fate of a queen began to unravel. Cromwell saw it first. He had risen from obscurity by sensing the faintest tremor in royal favor and moving before others felt it. As Henry's chief minister, he had remade England, tearing it from the Pope's grasp, seizing monastic wealth, and refashioning the crown's authority in the language of divine law. Yet in that spring, his position was perilous. Anne had turned against him, challenging his redistribution of the church's riches. She spoke openly of his greed, and in the serpentine world of Tudor politics, that was enough to mark him for destruction. Cromwell understood the paradox of survival. Sometimes, to save oneself, one must destroy the sun around which all else revolved. "If she does not fall," he is said to have murmured to an ally, "we shall." From that moment, his strategy ceased to be defense and became design. It began subtly, with whispers, the kind that grow teeth as they travel. A jest exchanged at a tournament, a glance too long between a queen and a courtier, the laughter of a musician in the royal apartments. These became threads. Cromwell plucked them one by one, spinning them into a tapestry of treason. Mark Smeaton, the gifted young musician whose melodies once softened the Queen's melancholy, was the first to be ensnared. On April 30th, he was summoned to Cromwell's house in Stepney. No warrant, no fanfare, only the quiet authority of the king's will. Neighbors later reported strange sounds through the night. A man crying out, then silence, then the creak of a door at dawn. Smeaton emerged pale, trembling and broken. Within hours, word reached the court that he had confessed, to adultery with the Queen, and to knowing of others who did likewise. Whether he truly spoke or had words forced from him by fear and pain, no record survives. But his confession was enough to set the snare. Henry Norris, the king's closest friend and groom of the stool, was arrested next. The timing was cruelly deliberate. It was May Day, a festival of renewal and fertility. As the king's horse galloped from the jousting field, Norris was taken aside, questioned, and never returned to his home again. "If thou art guilty," Henry is said to have told him coldly, "thou art no friend to me." Norris, loyal to the end, swore innocence, but his denial meant little against the tide now rising. One by one, others followed. Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, even Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. Cromwell's case was not built on proof, but on precision. He understood that spectacle, not evidence, was the heart of Tudor justice. A charge of adultery could be whispered away. But treason, conspiracy against the king's life, was sacred theater. To accuse a queen of desiring her husband's death was to accuse her of desecrating the divine order itself. The interrogations blurred truth and invention. Witnesses were coerced, confessions rehearsed. Some at court knew the accusations were absurd, that the supposed dates of Anne's crimes placed her miles from her alleged lovers. Yet few dared speak. The memory of Thomas More's execution the previous year lingered like a warning carved in bone. Conscience was a luxury that did not survive in Henry's England. Cromwell presented his findings to the king in early May. Henry's reaction, according to one observer, was, as a man newly awoken from a dream of great deceit. He wept, raged, and swore vengeance upon the woman he had once called his only one of earth. Whether those tears were born of heartbreak or relief is impossible to say. But within hours, Anne was arrested in her chambers and taken to the Tower. As the barge slid along the Thames beneath the gray sky, she asked, "Mr. Kingston, shall I die without justice?" The constable replied, "Madam, the law will judge you." To which she answered with bitter wit, "Then I am already condemned." Inside the Tower, the machinery moved swiftly. A grand jury of peers, most indebted to Cromwell's favor, convened at Westminster. The indictment listed adultery with 5 men and conspiracy to murder the king. It was, by any rational measure, a fabrication stitched from rumor. Yet in the political calculus of the Tudor court, reason was no defense against necessity. Cromwell watched it unfold with the detachment of a craftsman assessing his work. Each accusation, each name, each calculated leak to the court chroniclers had its purpose. Henry would have his freedom, Cromwell would have his survival, and England would have its illusion that divine justice, not human ambition, had spoken. When the verdict came on May 15th, it was delivered not in a whisper, but in a roar. Guilty. Anne's composure faltered only for a heartbeat, then steadied. "My lord," she said to her judges, "I think you have condemned a good man's sister without proof." The court clerk's pen scratched the record, and Cromwell's web tightened. Outside, the May blossoms had begun to fall, littering the palace gardens with white petals that looked, from a distance, like snow. The queen's fate was sealed, but the silence that had birthed her downfall was not yet done speaking. It would echo, in the corridors of power, in the haunted conscience of a king, and in the legend of a woman undone not by sin, but by silence itself. In the stillness before the blade, Cromwell's web gleamed, invisible, perfect, and deadly. When the sword fell on May 19th, 1536, it did more than sever the life of a queen. It split England's conscience in two. For a moment, the Tower stood still. The crowd began to disperse, their steps muffled by the straw beneath their feet, yet none could quite shake the feeling that something larger had died. The air itself seemed altered, heavy with the residue of a crime disguised as justice. The blood was washed away, the scaffold dismantled, but Anne Boleyn's presence lingered, an echo that refused to fade. In the days that followed, Henry VIII moved swiftly to erase her. The very next morning, he wore white to mark what he called a new beginning. By the end of the week, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Courtiers changed their emblems overnight. Servants replaced Anne's falcon crest with Jane's phoenix, and the royal printers revised the line of succession as if Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, had never existed. It was an erasure written in ink and fear. Yet in trying to blot her out, they ensured she would be remembered. Rumors began at once. Some claimed her heart had continued to beat after the blade fell. Others swore that her eyes had moved, as though searching for her child. Within a year, the Tower Guards spoke of a woman in gray who walked the green each May, her head cradled in her arms. The legend spread not as superstition, but as collective guilt. The Tudor court had created a saint for its own damnation. But ghosts were not the only way Anne survived. In letters, in portraits, and in the careful silence of those who had known her, fragments of the living woman persisted. Chapuis, the imperial ambassador who had long despised her, confessed privately that her death was the saddest spectacle that ever was seen. One of her ladies, Jane Parker, haunted by what she had witnessed, would later share her husband's fate on another scaffold. Even Thomas Cromwell, who had orchestrated her ruin, would follow her to execution 5 years later, his own head falling under the same cold justification of treason. And then there was Elizabeth. A child of 2 years when her mother died, she grew up surrounded by the whispers of that disgrace. Her very existence was a reminder of her mother's fall. When courtiers addressed her as bastard princess, she did not flinch. She learned to wear the insult like armor. During her early years at Hatfield, she kept a miniature portrait of Anne hidden within a ring, her mother's delicate face framed in gold. It was not defiance, but devotion disguised as discretion. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, the echo of that May morning took on new resonance. The daughter of the condemned queen became the living refutation of her father's judgment. Her reign did not rewrite Anne's story with open rebellion. Instead, it rebalanced it through silence and symbolism. In her coronation procession, Elizabeth's chosen motto, Semper Eadem, always the same, was a quiet reclaiming of her mother's resilience. She revived her mother's falcon emblem, reshaped into a phoenix rising from flames. No decree was issued, no name restored, yet through the power of image and ritual, Anne was returned to history, not as traitor, but as progenitor of a golden age. Still, the image of Anne Boleyn did not rest easily. Each century redrew her face. To the Protestant chroniclers of Elizabeth's court, she became the virtuous martyr who had freed England from Rome. To Catholic writers, she remained the temptress who lured a king into damnation. In the Romantic Age, she was recast as a tragic heroine, betrayed by love and crushed by tyranny. And in the centuries to follow, she became whatever the age required: feminist icon, political victim, or ambitious schemer undone by her own intelligence. What made her story so enduring? Perhaps it was that she lived at the intersection of faith and desire, where history itself was being remade. The Reformation was not merely a struggle of doctrine, but of identity, and Anne Boleyn died in an age that believed kings ruled by the will of God. Yet her story, rising from scaffold to legend, suggests a different kind of immortality, the defiance of a voice that history tried to silence. The sword was swift. The silence was centuries long, but the echo, that will never die.